Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. Animorphs is back, in graphic novel form. And when Animorphs is back, the Opinionated Animorphs book guide is back, baby. Published by Scholastic on October 6th, 2020 in hardcover, paperback, and ebook, Animorphs Graphix number 1, The Invasion, is a direct adaptation of the very first Animorphs book, number 1, The Invasion, from 1996. Adapted and illustrated by Chris Grine, this 240-page comic gives visual life to the original story without the restraints of a television budget and late 90s special effects. And it's okay. I mean, it's good. It's solid. A 3 stars out of 5 kind of deal. And I want to get that out first because this is a new product, which makes this video much more a consumer review than what I usually do. The Animorphs book guide of old was a retrospective look on a long-loved and well-out-of-print franchise. This video may actually sway a person or two as to whether or not they'll spend their money on this book. So let's take care of that up front. Animorphs the graphic novel is the first major piece of Animorphs merchandise since the, in my opinion, ill-conceived reprints back in 2011 and 2012. Even if it's adapting a pre-existing story, it's the first major creative entry in the Animorphs franchise since number 54 The Beginning in 2001, nearly 20 years ago. In short, Animorphs the graphic novel is an important book for Scholastic to determine if Animorphs still has any lasting pop culture legacy. Does the brand still have popular, profitable merit? For Animorphs fans who want to see new creative entries into the franchise, for those who want to see this material find a fresh young audience, well, voting with your dollar is the way to make that happen. I have both praise and major criticism to level at this book, but it shakes out as a decent version of a beloved story, an inoffensive look back at the franchise's origins. The casual Animorphs fan who's looking for a new way to feel nostalgic for a familiar story will be happy with it. And the I don't like it when an adaptation changes things crowd doesn't have that much to complain about here. For people who have never read Animorphs, this is a fun introduction to the franchise. And most importantly, it's reasonably priced. God, I'm talking about pricing now. What's become of me? So with that consumer report out of the way, how exactly does Chris Grine go about adapting The Invasion into a medium of sequential art? And how did this even come to be? Animorphs started as the much more mature little sister of Scholastic's other big monthly paperback genre series, Goosebumps, and it continues to be so to this day. Everything Animorphs did, Goosebumps did first. Goosebumps had a TV show first. Goosebumps had a movie first. And yes, Goosebumps had graphic novel adaptations first. In 2005, Scholastic premiered their Graphix imprint, with an X, as a brand to publish their color reissues of Jeff Smith's Bone comic, but quickly used it to expand some of their more popular brands into the graphic novel market. In 2006, both Goosebumps and the Babysitters Club began a line of graphic novel adaptations of their original books. The Babysitters Club comics kept it simple, one book to one graphic novel with a consistent artist. But Goosebumps went wild, cramming 3 books into one volume, each of the 3 stories done by a different artist. I can't speak to the sales of these books, but after a few years, publication ceased, with only 4 Babysitter Club graphic novels and only 3 Goosebumps graphic novels published before 2008. But this proved just to be an extended break. In 2015, a new volume of Goosebumps Graphix was printed, a compilation of 3 previous stories plus 1 new one. And in 2017, the Babysitters Club Graphix resumed with a new artist, and the series continues to this day. So with this renewed interest, The idea of Animorphs Graphix makes sense, right? The thing is, though, for Goosebumps and Babysitter's Club, those franchises have remained viable, because Scholastic has never stopped supporting them. New Goosebumps books have been coming out consistently since 2008, and even in the 8-year gap between Goosebumps 2000 and Goosebumps Horrorland, the original series remained in print. Plus, there were 3 graphic novels. Also, a couple of movies. The original Babysitter's Club series ended in 1999, and its follow-up series, The Babysitter's Club Friends Forever, ran just till 2000. After that, the only new Babysitter's Club story was a prequel published in 2010. But Scholastic has been consistently re-releasing the main books in the series for years, with reprints in 1995, 2001, 2010, and 2020, plus graphic novels, and a Netflix series. Animorphs, successful in its day, has never had that kind of modern support, partially because, well, it ended, rather conclusively. Goosebumps is an anthology and can theoretically go on forever. Animorphs was also incredibly complicated and violent. Say what you will about the Babysitter's Club, but it certainly wasn't that. Of course, there was one exception to that, the 2011 reprints of the first 8 books. Word on the street was that these reprints were to gauge interest in a possible Animorphs movie, or maybe even a sequel series. And the reprints flopped. It's hard to say for sure why they flopped, but the covers certainly didn't help, trading in the iconic morphing art of David B. Mattingly for much less evocative animated covers whose morphing animations don't work as JPEGs on Amazon. The strength of those original covers in hooking kids in cannot be understated, and if the goal was to attract these stories to a new young audience, that wasn't the way to go about it. So after 7 books were published in print and an 8th that was only published as an ebook, the Animorphs franchise lay dormant once again, only living in the realm of millennial nostalgia, with listicles, shoddy YouTube videos, and podcasts. So many podcasts. And since the reprints were about gauging interest in the brand, I don't think any of us really thought we would get any more Animorphs. And then, we did. We fast forward to early 2017 with Catherine Applegate and Michael Grant dropping word on their Twitter accounts that an Animorphs graphic novel was being considered by Scholastic. Scholastic cast a net out for artists, and as time progressed, some of the rejected artists who didn't make the cut began to post their samples to social media, offering us a number of what-ifs over the final product. It would be a few years before the project settled, and on January 14th, 2020, Scholastic Graphix announced an October 2020 release, and the project's official artist, Chris Grine. Grine is no stranger to Scholastic Graphix. His Eisner-nominated 2006 Dark Horse comic Chicken Hair, a story about weird animals on the run from murderous taxidermy, was republished by the imprint, and in 2017, Scholastic published Grine's Time Shifters, an off-the-wall sci-fi romp with a robot Abraham Lincoln and a guy named Vampire Napoleon. So Grine's got tonal dissonance down, totally a required skill when adapting Animorphs. And so a 3-book contract was signed, each graphic novel being 1-to-1 with the first 3 Animorph books. Meaning there is a very, very good chance we're going to see a comic book version of Dealing Dan Hawk, which I need in my life very badly. Unrelated to the graphic novel, there's also an Animorphs film project in very, very, very early pre-production. Which, we'll have to wait and see on that one. But just 4 years ago, it seemed like we'd never see another Animorphs project ever again. Now it's an Animorphs renaissance. But how well does the graphic novel contribute to it? Animorphs Graphix #1 is faithful to the original book to a fault. Every scene, every story beat from the original 1996 book is there. From our protagonist walking home through an abandoned construction site, to our protagonist making quick retreat from a botched rescue mission in the Yerk pool. If you're the kind of person who gets upset at changes from the source material, you won't really have that much to complain about here. But what that also means is that the graphic novel retains many of the flaws and underdeveloped ideas of Kay Applegate's freshman effort. Ideas that would be subtly altered or retconned or rejected as the series progressed and the series' main ideas became cemented. Here's a small, pretty unimportant example. When the Yerk ships are landing on the construction site and Elfangor is quietly explaining each alien to our hiding protagonists, we get our first look at the taxons. And Elfangor says, "Taxon controllers, Taxons are evil. This little moment is 100% accurate to the original 1996 book. The problem, and I want to stress this is not a big problem, is that this little moment was written before Kay Applegate had developed the backstory for Elfangor or fleshed out the culture of the Taxons. The original book was published before Applegate wrote about Elfangor discovering that the Taxon submitted willingly narrative was Andalite propaganda, about Elfangor fighting alongside the Taxons in a civil uprising, about Elfangor's best friend becoming permanently stuck in Taxon form and joining the Taxon cause. That kind of thing is easy to brush off as growing pains when it comes to the original book. Applegate didn't know this about Elfangor or the Taxons yet. But this isn't the original book. This is a revision of the original book 24 years later, 19 years after Animorphs became a complete product. And none of that hindsight is considered here. There are quote-unquote fixes, namely the ones that the 2011 reprint made. The biggest being the concept of non-morphed humans being able to mentally communicate with those who are morphed, something the first book established and then completely dropped for the rest of the series. The reprint takes that out, and so does the graphic novel. On the flip side, one of my bigger criticisms of the first book was the narrative convenience of Tobias having a bunch of information quickly dumped into his brain by Elfangor. It's a plot detail that never comes up again in the series, and it's only here because it's a quick and easy way to introduce the protagonist to the concept of Yeerk pools. I can rationalize its inclusion, that the first book had to get to the Yeerk pool by the end, and there wasn't enough time and or page space for the character to discover it organically in the story. But it's still a very weak plot element. And yeah, the reprint retains that weak plot element, and so does the graphic novel. Though in fairness, the graphic novel is much more clear about what's happening when Elfangor does his mind trick on Tobias. Much of the adherence to the source material comes through in dialogue. This comic book is soaked in word balloons. I would say roughly 85% of the original book's dialogue is represented here, practically copied and pasted in most cases, even when it wouldn't make sense to have that dialogue in a graphic novel. Consider this moment in the original book, as the Animorphs are talking about Elfangor's ship as it lands in the construction site. We all just stood there, as the ship hummed and glowed and slowly settled down in an open space between piles of junk and tumbled walls. I noticed there were black burn marks along the top of the pod section. Some of the skin of the pod had been melted. It touched the ground and instantly the blue lights went off. Rachel's hair fell back down onto her neck. "It isn't very big, is it?" Rachel whispered. "It's about," I tried to think, "about 3 or 4 times as big as our minivan." Now this is an instance of the graphic novel actually changing the specific dialogue a little bit, going from 4 times as big as our minivan to maybe twice as big as a school bus. But that's not the issue. That's fine. The issue is the intent of that dialogue. A book is a book, and a book is not a visual medium. That beat of dialogue is there to help further communicate the scale of this fantastical object, of something that does not exist in our real world. If you said that dialogue in real life, it would be kind of awkward, right? But for the book, it serves a purpose. The graphic novel is a visual medium. You don't need the characters discussing the scale of this alien spacecraft because the reader can see the scale of this alien spacecraft. You can scale it off the characters and the environment. But because this dialogue beat was in the original book, it has to be here as well, even though it no longer services the story. These kind of dialogue versus visual incongruities are not uncommon here. For example, in the landing of Elfangor's ship in the construction site, we maintain a low perspective of the ship, only seeing its underside. And that's cool, that's a good idea. We're holding the same point of view as these characters. We're in the weeds with them. But in this moment, Jake observes, as he does in the original book, that tail thing looks like a weapon. Except we readers of this graphic novel haven't really seen the tail thing yet. Those new to Animorphs will have no idea what Jake is talking about when he refers to the tail thing. How Grine wants to present this landing spacecraft comes into conflict with where the dialogue beats are. These elements are not in harmony, they're out of sync, and they're not complementing each other as they should. While the graphic novel holds the book's original dialogue as sacred, the actual first-person prose is completely missing. And I totally understand why. To complement the prose would mean packing these already busy pages with text boxes and thought bubbles. Again, this is a visual medium. We're trading the prose in for visual communication. The problem is that the book doesn't trade in the prose for visual communication. Yes, the plot plays out the same, but so much important information, explanations, backstory, character details have all vanished. For example, nowhere in the graphic novel do we establish that Jake and Rachel are cousins. It's never brought up in dialogue. It's never communicated to the reader. Remember, the ideal audience here isn't the longtime fans who know this series in and out, but to grab a completely fresh audience with a new version of this story. And when you don't establish familial bonds like this, you know what you get? Accidental incest ships. Nobody wants accidental incest ships. I can still hear the cries of the Amy Pond/River Song shippers when I close my eyes. Lots of important character information is left out. We do know about Cassie's barn because in the first book the characters go there. And we do know about the death of Marco's mom because in the first book he talks about that. But we don't know that Jake saved Tobias from a bunch of bullies, which is a very important part of Tobias' character. It's the reason Tobias hero worships Jake and why he insists Jake should be the team leader. The problem with chucking the prose and all relevant information contained within is that this story is still exclusively from Jake's perspective, though the book doesn't advertise that fact. Jake isn't the exclusive character on the cover like he was back in the original book. Instead, we get a crowd scene of our 5 heroes with their backs to us. There's this bit at the top with Jake morphing a lizard, but that doesn't communicate anything. The book also doesn't start with, "My name is Jake." There is an intro, but it's plural, in reference to the group as a whole. We can't tell you our last names. We can't tell you where we live. There is nothing here that says this is exclusively Jake's perspective. If you're new to the story, you might not realize this until like 2/3 of the way when you discover, hey, this story is sure keeping itself hugged to Jake's hip, isn't it? It didn't have to be this way. I think telling the story of Number 1 The Invasion from the perspective of the entire group would have been a really fun and interesting way to breathe new life into the story. Show us Tobias and Marco's and Rachel and Cassie's lives. Show us where their characters come from and what they're fighting for and their history together. Yes, you're writing new material, and that runs the risk of doing something out of character or contradicting something in a future book, but as we've already established, the graphic novel has no qualms keeping in the inconsistencies of the original text. You know how it goes. Show, don't tell, as the classic piece of writing advice says. But so many times, the graphic novel opts to not show or tell. Okay, this has all been pretty negative so far. What are some things the graphic novel does well with the story? Well, it handles the story's time period really, really well. I'm happy to report that it doesn't make the mistake of the 2011 reprints by trying to update the story with modern technology and pop culture references. I have made the argument a number of times that Animorphs works best in the very specific political and technological climate of the mid-1990s. It's not a timeless story, and is harmed in attempts to modernize it. And the graphic novel doesn't modernize it at all. But it also doesn't embrace its 1990s setting. As much as I would love an Animorphs period piece with President Clinton on the square CRT television, and Rachel listening to 9 Inch Nails on the bus, and some kids at school tossing some pogs, the graphic novel makes the very wise decision to diminish as many time period signifiers as it can. Tobias is often listening to music through a set of headphones, but we never get a clear look of what those headphones are plugged into. Could be a Walkman, could be an MP3 player, just can't tell. When Jake and Marco are playing video games in Jake's room, we don't get a clear look at the game they're playing or the system they're playing on. Could be a Sega Master System, could be a PlayStation 5. Who can say? That makes perfect sense from the perspective of finding a new young audience for this story. If you're bringing in readers who were born in 2007, you don't want to be confusing them with references to VCRs or Nights into Dreams or Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman or whatever. That would do nothing but distract from the story. I mean, some of the 90s stuff is unavoidable. The book does open with Jake and Marco in an arcade at the mall. Two things that aren't impossible to find in 2020, but are getting rarer by the minute. And even then, the graphic novel refrains from identifying stores in the mall or specific games in the arcade. It keeps things as timeless as possible. And, what else? The story is well paced? Okay, there really is a lot of good stuff here, but it's good stuff that originated from the 1996 book, not the graphic novel's interpretation. And if I can allow myself just one moment of weakness, one moment of, ugh, I can't believe you changed that nitpickiness, I want to bring up this scene where Marco coins the term Animorphs. Here's how it plays out in the original book. "I can get in for free," Cassie said. "You guys will have to pay, but I can use my mom's employee discount, so it'll be cheaper." "Oh, I'm sure we could talk them into letting us in for nothing," Marco said. "Tell them we're Animorphs." "Tell them we're what?" Rachel asked. "Idiot teenagers with a death wish," Marco said. "Animorphs." I tried the word out. It sounded okay. And here's how that scene plays out in the graphic novel. "I can get us all in with my mom's discount. I bet we can get in for free if we just tell them we're Animorphs." "Tell them we're what?" "That's dumb, Marco."
You actually go outside in these things? What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Of course, the main draw of an Animorphs graphic novel is to bring a fresh visual identity to a well-loved story. And when it comes to the weird and the alien, the graphic novel goes in hard. I love the creature designs in this book. Aliens that are still recognizable from how they're described in the text and the versions seen on some of the cover art, while still being a unique interpretation. I love how wide the Hork-Bajir's hips are, how their blades are not really bony protrusions but lethal extensions of their flesh. I love how the taxons have traded in a centipede look for something closer to maggots. The soft bodies, the plainer coloring, they evoke a kind of rot that the more classic design doesn't. Andalites are no longer uniformly blue but have striped patterns, and they're not the smaller, elfin-like deer creatures that I once imagined, but bulkier and more horse-like. Visor 3 is thick. The Yerk's Dracon beams have this little glass ball of liquid on the back, presumably a fuel source, which I found charming in a Flash Gordon kind of way. But even better than that is the morphing. The morphing in this book is disgusting, and I love it. There aren't many detailed sequences of morphing as seen in the original covers, but plenty of shots of characters mid-morph that really sell how nightmarish the process actually is. These are the moments in the graphic novel that most closely tap into the darker, more dangerous edge of the source material. Animorphs is surprisingly distressing, and these moments of morphing really get that. Also, small detail I appreciate, every character has a unique color for their thought speech bubble. Thumbs up. Grimes does animals really well too, nailing the size and anatomy and movement of tigers and elephants and little lizards. That's one area you definitely can't mess up in an Animorphs graphic novel, and I'm glad to say they don't mess it up. The actual violence on display matches that in the original book, meaning in this instance, the violence is graphic, but it's fantastical violence directed at inhuman alien creatures. We get plenty of alien blood and guts, but the Animorphs themselves don't get hurt that badly, as is true of number 1, The Invasion. I am very curious as to how the graphic novels are going to handle violence against the protagonists going forward. Is Scholastic and Grine really going to show Jake's guts spilling out of his tiger morph, or Rachel using her dismembered arm as a weapon? It's hard to imagine it with the graphic novel's more cartoony world design. The human characters in the Animorphs graphic novel follow what I guess is Grine's personal style. Large eyes, minimalist mouths, and shiny red Rudolph noses. Alternate joke. Shiny red W.C. Fields noses. Jake, you been into the gin again? Unfortunately, none of these characters strike a really strong profile, and are visually defined by skin tone and hair, which in some cases still is not enough. Okay, I'm going to show you a panel from the graphic novel for about as long as it takes to read. Now, for those who haven't already read the graphic novel, who was that? Was that Rachel or Tobias? Because when I first read it, I had no idea. Tobias is given long blonde hair in the graphic novel, which is very accurate. I'm so used to seeing an inaccurate Tobias in all these other mediums. The first cover model for the books had dark hair and gave off an outsider's vibe, something that the Nickelodeon show picked up on. A new, actually blonde model was eventually picked for the covers, but by that point the books had changed the description to his hair to dirty blonde as a way to compensate for the discrepancy. This is the first time that, visually, Tobias feels like Tobias, at least for me. The problem is that it's pretty much the same blonde color as Rachel, and with it being past shoulder length, having close-ups that cut out character detail make panels like this way harder to read than they should be. For the record, that was Tobias. You can just see his headphones on the bottom of the frame, and Rachel has small earrings and a tiny bit of eyeliner. This is what I mean when I say the characters don't have strong profiles. If you can't easily identify a character from a glance, you have a problem. And that's my only major criticism of the art itself. The human characters could use a little more definition, and the red noses are just distracting. Everything else, alien design, animal designs, the morphing, the action, I'm so here for it. And I look forward to how it advances as these graphic novels continue. Post-book follow-up. I have a strong hesitation for poo-pooing this project in this way. Not just because we kinda need the sales for Animorphs to survive as a franchise, but because there's still a lot of love here. The story is still exciting and sets up the conflict well, but those are strengths of the source material. The graphic novel has some really good art, but doesn't really add to the source material as much as I feel it should. It doesn't advance the work in a meaningful way. A lot of stuff lost in adaptation isn't compensated for with visual storytelling. Adjustments aren't made to reflect the Animorphs series as a complete work, and a strong adherence to source material blocks us off from exploring the characters in new and interesting ways. I know we live in a world of toxic fandoms, where you get death threats if you don't make a Star Wars movie exactly to specifications, and that sucks. But appealing to the fans is an overvalued goal. I'm a huge fan of Animorphs, and I do not want you to try and appeal to me because I'm a fan. You don't need to appeal to the fans. The fans already own the books. If we wanted to read the exact same story from 24 years ago, we can just grab the book from 24 years ago. The goal here should be to make a great story, relevant to what the fans want. The Animorphs graphic novel has some great art. It handles certain issues well, but for the most part, it is an inferior version of this story because it doesn't do its own thing. The art and the script are not in sync with each other. Lots of important information gets left out because nothing comes in to substitute the cut prose, and the frames are just jam-packed with word balloons in order to get in as much dialogue as possible. I hope that a new reader will still find it engaging and want to see what happens next. I'm crossing my fingers, but it could have been better than just okay. I give Animorphs Graphix #1 The Invasion a 6 out of 10.